Alright everyone, now that we're set up with Bootstrap, let's talk about how to use it. Here I am, once again, at getbootstrap.com, and the first place that I want to go is documentation. So up at the top in the nav bar, right next to home, there's the documentation section. I'm going to click into that, and one of the most useful things about Bootstrap are its pre-built, ready-to-use components. So here on the left, it starts us in the introduction section, but down below that there's layout, content, and then components. If you don't see this menu on the side, it's probably because you have your window too small. Either expand your window so you see that sidebar, or if you don't see it, you can simply expand the menu up here by clicking on this hamburger button, these three bars. And we want to select components. Whether we see the sidebar or not, we want to select components. Components then expands once again in this sidebar, and we can see all these possible component types: modals, navs, navbars, pagination, jumbotron, forms, dropdowns, carousel, card, buttons, breadcrumbs, alerts. All of these are ready to use Bootstrap code, or pieces of code, if you will, that that can really go a long way towards helping us rapidly build a site. So let's just take a look at a couple of examples. Buttons are a pretty common one. If I click into the buttons section under components, it shows me a series of buttons that say primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark, and then this last one that says link. These are some examples of Bootstrap buttons, and down below is the code for each one of these buttons. Okay, we can see the text content of this first button is primary, so that matches up with this blue primary button, and then this one which says warning matches up with this warning button. And if you notice, there's nothing unusual about these button elements, nothing at all. The only thing that causes them to look the way they do and behave the way they do, notice that there's even a slight hover effect when I hover my cursor over them, is these class names. The first class is BTN, and then the second class is this BTN-secondary or -success. Or -info, -light, -dark. Okay, so just to dip our toes in the water, let's try creating a Bootstrap button. I'm going to code a button element, type equals button, class equals BTN space. Let's try BTN-info. And it's going to say click me. Okay, and there we go. I have an immediate Bootstrap button. What do we notice about this button right off the bat? It's obviously this light ocean blue color. The text inside of it is white. It has zero border. There's some slight curving of those corners there, so there's obviously some border radius in action. And finally, it actually has a hover effect. It has a hover effect that is automatically triggered when I hover my cursor over it. That hover effect makes the background color slightly darker, and it obviously has some kind of transition effect because I see that hover effect happen over the course of probably a quarter to a half of a second. It doesn't just clip into a darker color, it fades into that darker color. So I know that there must be a transition effect at work as well. All of this is coming from these Bootstrap classes. Nowhere else. There's no other magic happening. There's no JavaScript. There's nothing crazy going on here. We have given this button these two classes, and these two classes, thanks to the bootstrap.css style sheet, which we attach to our index.html, carries with it that much information. So let's take a closer look at this button using the inspector. I'm going to highlight the button, select it, and now let's take a look in my Styles tab. So in my Styles tab, I can see right off the bat .btn-info. So this is the CSS selector, which applies styles to elements with the class of btn-info. And I see color, #FFF. So this is what turns the text color white, background color, and we have a hex code for that teal color I can turn on and off. And, oh, I was wrong. It does have a border, but the border is the same color as its background color. So turning that off doesn't actually do anything. But it does have a border. Okay, and what else? .btn, that first class, because remember we have btn is one class, btn-info is a second class. So .btn is the selector which applies the following styles to all elements with the class of btn. And there's a lot going on here. Display, inline block, font weight 400, text align, center, white space, no wrap, vertical line, middle, user select, none, border, padding, font size, line height, border radius, transition. So there's that transition property I was talking about. And border radius, if I turn that off, see the corners of the button go from slightly curved in to sharp. Anyway, the point is there's a lot going on with that .btn selector, with that btn class, that button class. And this all comes from Bootstrap's style sheets. All of this is CSS, which we don't have to write. All we need to do is apply to our buttons the class of btn, and if we want a second class of btn-info. Okay, so whenever you use a Bootstrap component like this, and I'll show you a couple others before we wrap up. Whenever you use a Bootstrap component, I encourage you to open your inspector, select the element, and take a closer look at exactly what's happening behind the scenes, at exactly what these classes are doing. It's not a great idea to try to memorize Bootstrap classes. That's almost never something I recommend. What I would recommend is trying to recognize the patterns. And I'll point out some of those patterns to you. But the very first one that we have here is, if I jump back to our components page and our buttons section, you see how the only difference between all of these Bootstrap buttons is the suffix, if you will, to this button hyphen something class. Button primary, button secondary, button success, button danger, button warning, button info. All I need to change is the suffix on the second class of my button to anything else, and it will change dramatically the look of my button. If I change it to warning, the color, the text color turns black, and the background color turns this bright yellow. Now that is actually a pattern that I can demonstrate to you right here. I'm going to add an H1 to my site right above my button, and I'm going to give my H1 a class of text hyphen warning. And now my text is the same bright yellow color of the background color of the button. So it stands to reason that I could also try text info. Now we have teal, or text primary. Now we have a very, very solid blue, text danger. I'll make it red. Okay, so these color suffixes, this hyphen success, hyphen warning, hyphen danger, hyphen light, hyphen dark, these are part of a larger pattern that you'll come to see as you experiment with more Bootstrap classes. That's the kind of thing I want you to recognize. That's the kind of thing I might want you to try to remember, but don't try to memorize all of the Bootstrap classes. There are too many. It's a waste of brain power, and it's a far more useful exercise to come to the Bootstrap documentation page and find what it is you need for a given scenario. All right, and once again, just to demonstrate how you should approach any one of these Bootstrap classes, if you're just looking to learn at this stage, highlight the element you've applied the new class to, and there is the selector for text-danger, and all it does is change the color of my text. That's all it does. Okay, so let's take a look at some other components. Another really useful one, and there's more to the buttons. You can scroll down and find that there are similar button classes for buttons that you only want to exist as outlines, like this. You can set the sizes of your buttons, BTN-LG for large or SM for small. A block level button, like this, a big, fat, wide button. Disabled buttons. All of these things you can set with Bootstrap classes, which saves you from writing a lot of CSS. And these are cool too, the radio buttons. Those are fun. Anyway, I encourage you to explore more, but let's take a look at another very, very useful component, and that is going to be the navbar. I know we've had a lot of fun building horizontal navbars for the past couple weeks, but Bootstrap takes a lot of the pain of that process away. And I'll show you. Let's go scroll down and find a nice and simple navbar example that we can use. Here's one, but it's got a lot going on. I don't want to use that one right now. But here, this one's not too bad. This one's pretty simple. This is the navbar. This is a Bootstrap navbar, and right below it is the code. This is another example. Right below it is the code. Another example. Right below it is the code. So whenever you come to a Bootstrap documentation page, you're going to find an example of the component that you're looking at and the code for that component right below it. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and select the code for this second Bootstrap navbar right here, this fairly simple one. Copy it, and I'm simply going to paste it in my body. It's right inside my body tag. Okay, so it looks like a lot of code, and it is. It's not a small amount of code for the navbar that we're building, but this is not code that you should memorize. Not even a little bit. Anytime you need a Bootstrap navbar, come to the Bootstrap page. Don't try to recreate this on your own. Not yet. Later on, if you really want to be able to recall this from memory, sure, do it. Go for it. It's useful. But right now, it's a much more valuable exercise to come to this page, find what you need, and pull it into your code and edit it the way you need. So let's save, load my page, and I'm super zoomed in. There's our navbar. Okay. So let's make a couple changes. I don't need this disabled link. I don't like that. So I can actually get rid of this disabled class to re-enable that link on the end. See how it's a lighter gray? If I reload now, it's the same color. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it entirely. Okay, and what else can we do? I want to push these links onto the right side. So I want navbar, which is acting as my logo, to stay on the left, and I want these links to push all the way over to the right. So I'm going to find this div. This is the div, the class of navbar nav. It contains all of the anchors that are the links we see on my navbar. And I'm going to give it another Bootstrap class. And this is going to be a class that I know already of ML Auto. And that causes the links to jump to the other side. ML Auto simply means margin left auto. And it automatically forces an element, a block element like a div, to push as hard as it can to its left, which will cause the element to to float to the right without using float. It will push as far to its right as it can. So by contrast, there's MR auto to make it push all the way to the left. There's also MX auto, which is the same as margin auto. That will center it. In fact, let's try that. Okay? Don't memorize it. Once again, don't memorize these. I'm showing you these classes so that you know they're out there. You can see how to use them, and you can maybe start thinking about the patterns in the classes you're seeing. All right, how about let's make this a dark nav bar with light text. Well, first instinct might be to jump into CSS. Jump into CSS, select our nav element, and give it a background color of dark gray and a color of white, right? But it does nothing. It does nothing. So let's open our inspector and figure out why. I'm going to select the whole nav element, and here are my styles from my main.css, and I can see background color is crossed out. Color is not, but it's still not working. My text is still not white. So first thing I want to do is I want to scroll up, and I want to find what is overriding my background color. And if I scroll up, I see this selector for .bg-light. And it's applying a very light background color. So this is overriding my custom style. So now I need to think about how can I override this or get rid of it entirely. Well, it's one style. It's coming from one class, bg-light. So how about I simply jump into my HTML, find that bg-light class, and delete it. That works. Now how about my color? For some reason, color is working, but I don't see it applying to the content of my nav. So let's select one of these text elements, and I can see there are once again classes which are dictating the color of these elements. This one's a little more complicated. I see .navbar-light space .navbar-brand, which means it's looking for an element with this class name inside an element with this class name. So what's going to happen if I change navbar-light? We've already seen -light somewhere else. We've seen it in our buttons. So what happens if I changed -light to -info? Well, now my anchor is blue. That doesn't help, but this class is also not applying. What if I changed it to navbar dark? It's still not applying. So I need to come in here and change this class. Let's change navbar light to navbar info. See what happens. That didn't work. And that didn't work because navbar info is not actually supported. But you don't know that. That's the kind of experiment you might want to try, the kind of logic you might want to exercise based on what we've already seen from Bootstrap components. Navbar is only going to take navbar light or navbar dark. If I type in navbar light, then anything with the class of navbar brand or nav item is going to have a dark text color, dark text on a light nav. If I change this to navbar dark, it's going to reverse it. And let me try some additional background colors. Let's try BG Danger. Let's see if that works. It does. And that gives us a bright red navbar. So this is a background color class. This is a class which sets a background color for my navbar. Danger, info, warning, success. Okay, and this is all coming from a class. So, copy over component code, edit it to fit your needs, and don't be afraid to experiment with the hard-coded classes there. Especially as you become more familiar with what Bootstrap can do, as you see more of the patterns, as you glean more strategies for using Bootstrap classes, you will feel more able to confidently edit the pre-built code so that it suits your needs. Last thing I want to say with regards to the navbar is notice how when I bring my page, when I make my screen smaller, my window smaller, the navbar actually collapses. And it collapses into this expandable button. I didn't code that. I didn't have to. Bootstrap supports it. Okay, and we're going to talk in a future video about how to edit when this navbar expands. I, for example, am of the opinion that it collapses a little too soon. I think our screen is still, our window is still big enough to support having all of our links visible. I think it collapses a little too soon. But in order to change that, all I need to do is experiment with one of the classes that is already in my document. We'll come back to that though. So that's the navbar. I'm not going to go through additional components. You should absolutely explore them on your own. But some popular ones are modals. Here's the code for a sample modal. It creates a button on your page, and when you click on it, a pop-up appears. And you can edit the text, title, the buttons inside this modal. Carousels are another very popular component for Bootstrap, and these are carousels of sliding images. Let's find one with controls. So this one even has buttons we can press to slide between the first, second, and third slide. Or if we wanted to add more, we would simply need to copy one of these carousel items, and we could add as many inside our carousel as we'd like. That's a very, very easy way to create a functioning, clean, responsive image carousel without any CSS or JavaScript. And there's some other cool stuff in list groups, cards. Cards are very popular. Cards like this. But components isn't the only thing I'd recommend looking into. Components is by far the most accessible, but the other thing I'd recommend looking at is the utilities section. The utilities section has a number of these sections, just like components, and some of them are going to make sense to you, some of them are not. But let's take a look at the text utilities. Text utilities. So this gives us classes related to handling text, like text left, text center, text right. And we can see here's text left, this is text center, this is text right. So you never have to write text align center ever again. Text wrapping and overflow, text transform, text uppercase is a class. Automatically causes all of the text inside to be uppercase. Font weight bold, font weight normal, font weight light, font italic. Okay, but there are quite a few more. There are quite a few more classes related to handling text. Vertical align, position, display. There are classes for governing the display properties of your elements. All of these are things to look into and experiment with. Okay, learning Bootstrap, especially at this point in time, is not an exercise in learning Bootstrap. It's an exercise in reading the documentation for a third-party library or framework and using it in your own code. It's something you're going to have to do a lot on the job. You're going to be doing a lot of it over the course of the next 11 weeks. So please try to take some time to dig into the documentation for Bootstrap as you work through the rest of this week's material and the exercises and project.